Christmas Surprise. This is a Christmas in Baublesville sweet romance. It's book 3. It's written by Susan Alison as Honeystone, and it's narrated by Susan Alison. Chapter 1. Oh, I can't wait. Emma bubbled with anticipation. She'd given up worrying about how excited she got, given how old she was now. She just went with it. And every year, when the time approached that Santa's Grotto was to be set up in the town's Christmas market, she could feel the joy of the festive season expanding until she thought she'd burst with it. Jenny, her best friend, was concentrating, her tongue sticking out between her teeth, on the icing she was applying to some tree-shaped biscuits. She merely grunted in response to Emma's eagerness. The green background icing that Emma had already coated the biscuits with was smooth. Jenny was adding little multicoloured blobs to represent baubles and lights on the tree. Emma noticed she'd managed to get icing everywhere within reach. Luckily, Emma knew Jenny of old and had set her up with her own icing station well away from anything else that might come to sticky harm from her friend's efforts. Festive iced biscuits were all part of the charm of this season. There would be others coming in to have an icing session too. Jenny had claimed first go this year. It was worth the mess to see her friend's glow of satisfaction as she surveyed the 3 she'd completed. After the icing station had been set up, Emma always had a steady stream of people wanting to come and have a go. They donated what they could to this year's charitable cause and had fun while doing so. Some of the biscuits were taken home and consumed. Some were hung on their tree. Emma made the biscuits with a hole in them for hanging, so the option was there. A little box of ready-cut lengths of narrow silken ribbon was on the counter, so they could be taken after the customer had washed up and was leaving. "What are you waiting for? Why don't you go? We both know you're dying to greet Santa. You're always the first of the year. You don't want to miss being first. Go on, off you go." "I can't go while you're covered in icing. What if, the minute I've gone, a customer comes in?" Emma said. Jenny immediately leapt up and ran out to the back room. Emma could hear her splashing about. She was still shouting at her, though. "Go on, go, before you're no longer the first on his lap." Emma headed for the shop door. Jenny added, "Give Santa Nick a hug for me and tell him I'll be in for my Christmas hug later in the week when the first rush has died down." "I will," Emma shouted before the door had shut behind her. Oh, she so loved Baublesville and all its festive traditions, but for it to be the actual time of year as well made it even more stupendous. She loved the Christmas market, and she loved Santa's Grotto, and she loved Father Christmas so much. The memory of the first time her parents took her, such a long time ago, was vivid in her mind. She'd sat on his lap and been too shy to say anything to him. She'd been so excited she'd been unable to keep her breakfast down. To her mother's huge embarrassment, she'd thrown up on Santa. But he was lovely and spoke soothingly to her while he cleaned her and himself up, refusing the offer from her mother to hurry her away from the scene of the crime. And then, even though she'd never said a word, he'd given her exactly what she'd always wanted. He'd given her a dog-shaped pyjama case. She still had it, Maximilian the dog, on her bed. It had a stain inside on the pale green satin lining where she'd hidden a sugar puff cookie for later and then forgotten it. She'd found it many weeks afterwards, melded to the inside. She loved that pyjama case. She loved Nick, the man inside the padded Father Christmas suit. After that first year, she'd wait with mounting excitement for the time she could persuade her parents to take her to the Christmas market, so she could throw herself onto Santa's lap and tell him her Christmas wishes. It was several years before that Kathy Flinders down the road made her cry by saying Father Christmas wasn't real, and that inside that suit was just an ordinary man, not a Christmas hero. That year, when she went to Santa's Grotto, she stood back from him, just staring. She realised later that he'd known instantly what had happened. He leaned forward, resting his gloved hands on his knees. He'd smiled at her such a welcoming smile that despite herself she'd edged closer to him. "I can see you're wondering about something, Emma," he'd said. She'd nodded her head while staring at her feet. His voice, low and gentle, had continued. "You know, some people don't believe in Father Christmas. They think all the magic is gone once they grow up. But here's the thing. Magic doesn't look the same to everyone. But there will always be magic, especially if you want there to be." Emma had looked over her shoulder at her parents, and they'd smiled encouragingly. It was a long time later before she realised how anxious they'd been at her upset after that Kathy Flinders down the road made her cry. When Santa had said what he'd said, they'd looked so relieved and nodded at him and at her, and all was right with the world again. He'd said, "The real Christmas magic is in us if we want it to be." Her mother had stepped towards her and tapped her chest and nodded at her. "It's true, Emma, love. It's in here." And she tapped her own chest too. Santa added, "It's in all the joy, love and kindness that make Christmas so special." Even her father, who'd always seemed so distant, had tried to make her feel better too. She'd never forgotten it. He didn't lean over her like a big person over a little person. He crouched down beside her so they were equal. He made her feel like she was the only person in the world. I've always thought the best part of Christmas isn't about who wears the red suit. It's about the magic you feel when you believe in Christmas. And I think you've got that magic inside you, Emma. It's why you always run in here with such excitement." After that, Emma still ran in there with great excitement. She'd take Santa's hand and tell him all about her hopes and wishes like she always had before. And he never let her down. And she always knew that as long as he was there in his grotto in the Christmas market every festive season, then all would be right with her world. She had wondered when she was the only adult to visit Santa whether she should stop or not. But she treasured the occasion so much she didn't want to. When Hazel, Nick's wife, had said to her how much Nick treasured it too, she knew she wouldn't ever stop. During the year, Nick was Emma's godfather. They never spoke of his Santa role, though. He was her godfather, except when he was Santa. He was a widower for many years until he met Hazel. She was a widow from the other side of Baublesville. They got together and were married 3 years ago. Emma liked Hazel, and if she said that Nick would be sad if she stopped being the first visitor to his grotto when he donned his red suit, then she wasn't going to stop, because the magic was still there. It had been a few years since she had thrown herself onto his lap, but the year her father suddenly died, it just happened perfectly naturally, and it was like having him back for a short, wonderful moment in time. Oh, how she missed her father's hugs. Over the years, Emma had become conscious that as she lost a bit of pudginess, Santa gained it, as if they were sharing it out between them. Having said that, in recent years, Santa had gained on her, so now it was like she was throwing herself onto the bed in her mother's spare room, which still had the old-fashioned eiderdowns on it. She would sink into them and snuggle in. She yelled, "Nick!" and raced towards Santa, who she'd just seen enter the grotto from the back and take his seat. She landed on his lap, and it wasn't at all soft and marshmallowy, but hard and unyielding. Emma shrieked loudly and ricocheted off. Standing in bewilderment and staring at Santa, Emma was mortified to realise it couldn't be Nick. There was no hearty laugh and affectionate greeting coming from the direction of the padded Santa suit, only a startled cough and an exclamation surely not meant for childish ears. Clearly Emma could see this was not Nick at all. It was a much younger man. She'd thrown herself onto the lap of a complete stranger. I'm so sorry, Emma gabbled, backing away. Horrified, she turned and ran from the grotto. She could only hope that she was in actual fact asleep, having a nightmare, and that tomorrow when she woke up she could chuckle over such a ridiculous dream. She would laugh and share the story with Jenny, and they would giggle over it all day. Unfortunately, she knew she was wide awake and not dreaming at all. She was doomed to live her life in disguise now, or be embarrassed for evermore. Chapter 2. I had no idea this role came with such great perks, Jack muttered to himself. He'd seen her running towards him, the joy on her face so wonderful that his heart melted under its onslaught. But he didn't know who she was, and he'd expected her to run straight past. He hadn't looked behind him to see what she was running towards, because he hadn't wanted to miss 1 second of gazing at her face. But she hadn't run past him. She'd taken a flying leap and landed on his lap, and immediately bounced off it again. Then she ran away, looking so flustered and shocked. He wanted to make her feel better, but she'd disappeared by the time he realised what had happened. "Oh no, was that Emma?" Hazel hurried out from the back. "I should have told her I didn't think of it. Oh no." "Mum!" Jack jumped to his feet and grasped his mother's hands. "I don't know who that was, but it's not for you to worry about. You've enough on your plate as it is." But Emma always runs in first when Nick sits on his Santa seat. He treasures that moment, always has since his best friend, her father, brought her to see him as Santa all those years ago. "She's not a little girl any longer, though," Jack said, "which is why it's so lovely that they still have that Christmas connection. I should have told her." "You haven't had time or mental capacity to think of it. Since Nick was taken ill, you've been running around doing all sorts, worrying yourself sick. Don't add something else to it. Emma will get over it." "I have to tell her now, though." "Well, I'll tell her after I've been to the hospital, so I know what I can say about Nick." Her voice wobbled, but she caught it in time. "It's good of you to come home at such short notice and stand in for him," she said. "It's the least I can do, Mum. Nick's been such a great stepdad to me, and I've always appreciated it. And it's already had its rewards." He grinned at his mother, hoping to see her frown lift a little, which it did. "Oh, you," she said, slapping him playfully on his arm. "Poor Emma. She must have got quite a shock." "Let me know as soon as you do what's what with Nick, please." "I will." Jack watched Hazel leave the grotto before he resumed his seat on the massive Santa throne. He caught glimpses of excited children outside being held back until he signalled they could start coming in. In his mind he kept replaying Emma's face, so lit with joy it could light up the darkest night, coming towards him as though it was him who'd caused that happiness. And he was suddenly consumed with the need to bring that look back to her face. Emma, head down so no one would see her, let alone recognise her, ran up the street. Of course, people greeted her all the way, so she might as well raise her head and look where she was going, or she'd add to her breathtaking embarrassment by falling over and breaking something as well. Trying really hard, she slowed down and returned greetings, willing her breathing to return to normal and stop feeling as though every gasp would be her last. "Morning, Mrs. Fellows. Yes, fine, thank you. Hope you are too." "Hi, Jeff. Hope your knee's better now." "Harry, how lovely to see you up and about again." Soon all the inhabitants of Baublesville would know what she'd done and be laughing at her. The only way was through. Finally she managed to get her head right up, and she strode out proudly, as if she'd never thrown herself onto the lap of a complete young stranger. Waves of cringe swept over her, but she wasn't going to give in to it, no. With great relief she realised she was at Frosty's Fancies now, and she dived into her shop as if she could hide there until the end of time. Of course she wouldn't be able to, because the inhabitants of Baublesville would all be piling in to view the woman who'd thrown herself at a complete stranger in Santa's grotto. But still, she would try to look on the bright side and think of the extra custom that would bring her way. "Em!" Jenny came running out. "Em, I've just heard." "Oh no, it's all over town already!" And Emma clapped her hands to her face and looked with horror at her friend through her fingers. What on earth are you on about? Jenny looked mystified. You're not talking about me throwing myself onto a complete stranger? No, I'm not. But you really need to give me all the gory details about that. Emma waved Jenny's curiosity away. What have you heard then? Nick was suddenly rushed into hospital. Daisy, their neighbour, was telling me this. She says there was no warning of it at all. Just a sudden onset of acute pain and vomiting. They reckon it's his gallbladder. Oh no, poor Nick, how awful. What does it mean though? Did she tell you? Well, he'll probably have to have his gallbladder taken out. That can be done in a couple of different ways. Either way, he'll have to avoid strenuous activities for a few weeks. Santa duties are out of the question. He might even be deprived of some of his Christmas feasts because he will need to avoid fatty foods for a while, I gather. So near Christmas too, what a shame. At least it doesn't sound too serious though. I mean in terms of his survival. There's no reason why he won't be here for next year's Santa roll. So anyway, who was that then? Who was that in Nick's suit sitting on Nick's Santa throne, like some sort of conquering invader? You've got your grumpy face on now, Jenny informed her. It's Jack, Nick's son, who, far from invading Nick's space, has kindly left his busy and very successful big city life to come back to country yokel town to fill the role so no one is let down. Jenny pulled her hair back from her face where it had already fallen out of her bun. Well, except for you, of course, you're still let down, but so that no one else is let down, so that all the children are kept happy at seeing Santa. Nick hasn't got a son, Emma stated, as if she was winning some sort of argument. Hazel has. He's Nick's stepson. Oh, yes, I've forgotten. Well, I'd just better make sure I never meet him then. It was embarrassing. It'll be difficult to never meet him in a town this size. No, it won't. I doubt he'll come in here for a start. I doubt very much any carbs ever pass his lips. Oh, you hung about on his lap long enough to find that out, did you? Jenny mock-punched Emma's arm. Bam! She yelled, and she fell about laughing like a lunatic. Emma didn't find it at all funny and stalked out to the back room where she made herself some hot chocolate for comfort, piling it high with whipped cream and mini marshmallows and chocolate flakes. Chapter 3. After drinking half her hot chocolate and cramming more marshmallows and chocolate into the space she'd made, Emma felt a little better. It failed to make the embarrassing memory of throwing herself onto a complete stranger's lap fade. In fact, she shuddered to think of it. The trick was to concentrate on this too sweet stickiness to soothe her nerves and take her mind off the whole incident. She dropped into one of the armchairs in the back of her shop, trying hard not to compare it to a lap, and sighed mightily. Why did things like this always happen to her? It was as if the universe, laughing gleefully, always waited for every opportunity to throw her under the nearest bus. Nick's stepson, she thought to herself. She hadn't consciously known he existed until today. Well, they'd known when Hazel came on Nick's scene that she had a son, but he'd never lived in Baublesville. He'd already left home and was making waves in the world of law in the city. How was she supposed to live this down? Jenny appeared in the doorway, holding a mug of coffee. She sported a horribly irritating, very wide grin. Emma tensed. She knew she hadn't heard the last of this from her best friend. So, Jenny said, plopping down next to Emma, tell me exactly what happened. Did he look like a red-suited Christmas hero, accustomed to flying over the rooftops, bringing joy to all? Or did he look more like a startled reindeer caught with his hoof in the sweetie jar? Remind me why you're my friend, Emma said. What if I said I didn't want to talk about it? I'm your friend because no one else wanted the job, Jenny said. And if you said you didn't want to talk about it, I'd say tough. Come on, let's have it. I want the full story. She helped herself to a chocolate flake and dipped it in her coffee, watching it melt into the black liquid. Emma rolled her eyes. Fine, if you must know. I threw myself onto his lap, expecting it to be soft and comfy like Nick's, you know, sort of like jumping into a pile of puffy cushions or a bed of feathers. But no, instead it was like launching myself at a brick wall. She stopped for a moment, breathing heavily. Gah! A young, handsome brick wall, she wailed. Even despite the beard, I could tell he was young and handsome. I can feel myself getting smaller just thinking about it. I want to get so small no one ever sees me again. She flopped forward until her forehead was on her knees. I bounced right off, she mumbled into her legs, and made a total fool of myself. He must wonder what he's come home to in this town. He probably thinks I've been let out of somewhere too early and should be locked up. Jenny snorted, making no attempt to hide her delight in her friend's story. Well, first of all, it's great that he's young and handsome. A hot Santa. Now that's something new for Baublesville. Women will be bringing their small children from all over to see this. Emma straightened up and glared at her. You're missing the point. I made a right idiot of myself. And now, every time I go to the Christmas market, he'll be there, sitting on that Santa throne, knowing that Emma Frost threw herself at him like a crazed Christmas elf. Oh, come on, it's a funny story. In a couple of weeks you'll laugh about it. Plus, it's not like you're the only person who's ever done something embarrassing. Last year I spilled an entire tray of those iced biscuits when the icing was still wet, all over Mrs. Huckleberry's Christmas sweater she was so proud of. Yeah, but you didn't throw yourself onto her lap. Jenny was laughing far too hard for Emma's liking. Some friend you are, she snapped. But Jenny only laughed harder, actually spilling her coffee over herself. Someone's got to keep your feet on the ground. You will laugh too soon, you will. Emma groaned again, sinking deeper into the cushions. Listen, Jenny said, more seriously now. Nick is in the hospital, and it's great that his stepson is stepping in for him. You've been going to see Santa for years, and it's one of your favourite traditions. Don't let this awkward moment ruin that. Plus, who knows? Maybe this Jack guy is a great, handsome Santa. Jenny paused, and Emma looked at her distrustfully. She was right to be suspicious as Jenny finished her sentence. Just with fewer cushiony features. Emma tried not to laugh, but in the end couldn't help it. I don't know. I still feel embarrassed, though. Hey, it's Christmas, the time of year when everything is a little ridiculous and magical. Maybe this is the universe's way of giving you a Christmas surprise. Some surprise, Emma muttered. Jenny shrugged. It could have been so much worse, she said. It could? How? But Jenny wasn't to be distracted from her train of thought. The important thing is not to let it spoil the occasion for you. Don't let it ruin your Christmas joy. Go back when you're ready and apologise properly. Who knows? You might even find yourself laughing about it with him. Emma wasn't sure if she was quite ready for that, but deep down she knew Jenny was right. The thought of facing Jack again made her stomach flip, but she couldn't hide in her shop forever. Baublesville was a small town, and sooner or later she was going to run into him again. Suddenly realising how much the day had already gone, Emma jumped up as a crowd of people entered the bakery. They'd come for their biscuit icing session, and the excited babble of their voices crowded out all thought of anything else. Jenny and Emma were kept busy supplying the biscuit ices with the uniced biscuits and the pre-filled icing syringes, along with decorating pens, spatulas and brushes. And then there were the containers of sprinkles in all shapes and colours, glitter, tiny sweets, crushed candy canes, coconut shavings for snowy effect, sugar pearls. The most popular shape of biscuit for icing today was the Santa. Of course it was, just when she wanted to forget all about Santa. Even though she thought she'd baked plenty, Emma still had to bake more to keep up with demand. Every one of those biscuit Santas leered at her, laughing at her discomfort, making her flush with embarrassment every time she flipped one to brown on the other side. Talking of Santas, one of the customers said, it's not Nick this year. He's in the hospital, although I gather he will be fine. A gallbladder thing, I think. Anyway, so it's a new young Santa this year, Nick's stepson. Anyone remember him? His name's Jack. Not really. Hazel only came on the scene a few years ago, and her son, Jack, was already making a good life for himself in the city. Emma strained to hear anything anyone said on the basis that knowledge is power, but unfortunately no one knew anything. However, no one mentioned some weird woman throwing herself at the new young handsome Santa either, so maybe that story hadn't got out into the wild yet. There was much raising of eyebrows along with speculation about Jack's private life, but it was all quickly silenced when some children came in to ice biscuits too. Everyone kept the secret of Santa to themselves. Well, everyone but that Kathy Flinders down the road. The icing biscuits for charity donations scheme was going very well. Emma was pleased. So she was in a much more mellow mood when Jenny broached the subject again of handsome Santa. "You're right," Emma said to Jenny. "I can't hide forever. I'll go back to the grotto." "I'm proud of you, Em," Jenny said. "Go make up with handsome Santa." Emma shook her head but smiled. "It's not like that." Sure, Jenny winked. "Just make sure you don't tackle him again. You've only got one chance to make a second first impression." Emma laughed. "I'll try to keep my feet on the ground this time." Chapter 4. Emma found herself lingering at the edge of the Christmas market. The grotto was just up ahead, festooned with twinkling lights, candy canes, and the red velvet curtains framing the entrance. A line of excited children and parents snaked outside the grotto, waiting for their turn with Santa. Emma stood there trying to muster the courage to walk over, but quailing at the thought of it. Apart from anything else, she couldn't just speak to him while he was dealing with a child, and there was a whole queue of them. Maybe this wasn't a great idea after all. "It's just a friendly chat," she reminded herself. "Nothing more. He's probably forgotten about the whole thing already." But maybe she should wait until later, at least until the grotto was closed for the day. She simply couldn't see how to do it with all these people around waiting to see him. She wasn't being cowardly, she assured herself. Just as she was about to turn and go back to Frosty's fancies, Hazel appeared, wending her way through the crowds towards her with a friendly smile. "Emma," she called out, bustling over to her. "I've been hoping to see you." Emma's throat closed for a choking second. Great, she thought. Hazel must know everything. "I heard about the incident earlier today," Hazel said. She was obviously trying not to grin. Emma cringed. "I am so sorry. I am so very sorry. I didn't know it wasn't Nick. Hazel put a hand on her arm. "Don't worry, dear. I just wanted to explain. Our son Jack is filling in for Nick while he's in hospital. I'm so sorry I didn't think to warn you sooner. I was so frazzled with everything happening all at once." Emma's embarrassment faded with her concern for her godfather. "How is Nick doing?" "He's had the surgery. He's stable, but they need to keep him for a few more days yet. But we're hoping he can come home soon. He won't be playing Santa this year, though. He's not allowed to do anything strenuous. He will hate it, and it'll be all I can do to make him behave in a suitably leisurely way. Jack will be taking over for the rest of the season." Emma nodded. "I'm really glad Nick is okay. I'll go and see him soon. Take him some Christmas biscuits. And I'll apologise to Jack for, Hazel chuckled. "Don't worry about it, dear. He wasn't at all upset. Surprised, but not upset. In fact, I think you gave him quite a memorable introduction to the role." Emma groaned. "I'm sure I did." Hazel patted her arm. "Go on, dear. He's just inside on the Santa throne." "But there's an enormous queue waiting to see him." "Best to get it over and done with," Hazel said firmly. "I'll get you a minute. You can be quick. Best to pull the plaster straight off. You can't get on his lap anyway in front of all these children." And she beetled off into the grotto. What? What did Hazel mean? Too late to back out now anyway. Taking a deep breath, Emma followed. She could barely think for the noise of singing and bells and children yelling and laughing. Just as well, really. She didn't want to think too much about this. It's just Santa, she told herself. A different Santa, a handsome Santa, but still Santa. As she stepped inside, she saw Jack sitting on the Santa throne, surrounded by twinkling lights, his Santa hat slightly askew. Hazel stood next to him. His eyes met hers as she approached, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Back for round 2, he asked, and grinned at her. Emma noticed Hazel slap his shoulder, but he ignored it. Emma blushed, but couldn't stop herself from smiling back at him. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice lowered. "I am so sorry about hurling myself at you earlier." "The pleasure was all mine," he said. He sounded as if he really meant it. "Okay, that's enough now," Hazel said, which was a good job because Emma had no idea what to say next. She was too covered in confusion. Confusion of a pleasant, warming kind. She knew what to think, though. She thought that maybe this particular Christmas surprise wasn't so bad after all. Chapter 5. Emma shifted the bag of gingerbread cookies from one hand to the other as she made her way down the hospital corridor, the faint scent of antiseptic making her wrinkle her nose. Hospitals always made her feel uneasy, but it was Christmas, and she couldn't let Nick lie there without a festive pick-me-up. Besides, he was like a second father to her. He was her godfather, for goodness sake. Visiting him with a batch of her locally famed gingerbread biscuits, complete with tiny icing smiles, seemed the least she could do. She pushed open the door to Nick's room. "Emma!" His warm, gravelly voice greeted her. He seemed pleased to see her. She was certainly pleased to see him. He sat up in the hospital bed, his white hair sticking out all round, looking like a dishevelled version of Santa in his pyjamas. The very picture of someone who should be in a red suit. "It's good to see you sitting up and looking so yourself," Emma said, advancing on him to give him a brief hug and a kiss on his cheek. She was very gentle in case anything hurt. "And I come bearing gingerbread." "You brought gingerbread? Bless you, girl. You always know what I need." "You mean apart from your gallbladder being ripped out?" Emma said. "The gingerbread I can do. The gallbladder thing not so much." She placed the bag of biscuits on the tray on his little table. "How are you feeling?" "Oh, I'm right as rain," Nick said, as she knew he would. "Just a bit sore. It's nothing I can't handle." "Right," Emma said, narrowing her eyes at him. "You're a terrible liar, Nick. I've seen that hospital food. I'm surprised you've lasted this long." Nick chuckled. He had exactly the right kind of chuckle for a Santa. "You're not wrong there," he said, "but I'll survive. It's Hazel I'm worried about." Emma raised her eyebrows. "Hazel? Why? What's wrong with Hazel? She didn't say anything." Nick waved a hand dismissively. "She wouldn't. She's fine, really. It's just, well, you know how she is. She's been running herself ragged, back and forth to the hospital, making sure everything's set for me when I get home, and still trying to help Jack with the Grotto." At the mention of handsome Santa Jack, Emma tried her best not to let her face flush. She really didn't need to revisit the image of launching herself onto his lap. The memory of it was enough to make her want to crawl under the hospital bed and stay there until Christmas was over. Nick must have seen something in her expression because he grinned. "Ah, you've met Jack already, I see." Emma cleared her throat. "Briefly," she said, choosing her words carefully. "We, had a bit of an introduction at the Grotto." "Did you now?" Nick raised an eyebrow. He was smiling, and Emma wasn't sure what to make of it. "Jack's a good lad. Came straight back from his big-shot lawyer job in the city when I got sick. Hazel didn't even have to ask. Dropped everything to help out." Emma blinked. "He left his job for you." Nick nodded, his face softening. He's always been a family man at heart, even with that high-powered career of his. When Hazel called, he came back without a second's thought. He's been trying to do as much as he can to help, but even with him home, Hazel's still overdoing things. You know how she is. Emma nodded. She felt a pang of sympathy for Hazel. She was very fond of her and knew she could be a bit like a whirlwind when she was stressed, doing 1,000 things at once and worrying about everyone except herself. Nick sighed and leaned back against the pillows, his expression turning a bit more serious. Emma, I don't want to ask you this, I really don't. You've got the bakery and everything else going on, but... Oh no, Emma groaned, already knowing where this was heading. Please tell me you're not about to ask me what I think you're about to ask me. Nick smiled sheepishly, looking as though he was caught sneaking extra gingerbread cookies. I hate to do it, but I'm worried about Hazel. She's taking care of me, trying to keep the house running, and now she's trying to help Jack with the grotto. She's going to wear herself out, Emma. I can't let that happen. Emma crossed her arms, giving him her best stern look, but she already felt her resolve slipping. Nick, I can't just leave the bakery. It's Christmas. My busiest time of year. I'm up to my elbows in gingerbread and icing. Nick gave her the full force of his Santa eyes, big, twinkly, and full of hope. It wouldn't be forever. The kids love the elf, and Hazel usually helps me out, but, well, this year... Emma groaned again. Nick, you know I can't say no to you when you look at me like that. It's practically blackmail. Nick chuckled, a warm sound that made Emma's heart melt a little more. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important, Emma, you know that. She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes heavenward. Fine, but I can't promise everything will go smoothly because around me they simply don't. I'll do it for the kids and Hazel, and to stop you worrying when you should be resting and getting better. Nick beamed. You'll be the best elf Baublesville has ever seen. Well, except for Hazel, of course. Just don't go jumping on anyone's lap again, all right? Not unless it's mine. Emma's face got very hot. Nick snorted. Hazel has a way of making sure I don't miss anything, he said, seemingly unable to stop laughing. Emma folded her arms and tapped her foot on the floor. Great. Now even Santa knows. Don't worry, Emma. I'm sure Jack didn't mind, Nick said. He managed to keep his face perfectly straight this time. She groaned, but deep down she felt a little spark of excitement, mixed with dread too, at the thought of being Jack's elf. What had she just signed herself up for? But in Baublesville, when Christmas called, you answered, even if it meant having to deal with an inconveniently handsome Santa. Chapter 6. Emma stood in Hazel's living room staring at herself in the floor-length mirror, staring at the oversized elf costume that hung from her shoulders like an abandoned but colourful canopy. It's a little roomy, she said, tugging at the fabric. The costume was festive enough, bright green with red trim and little jingly bells on the cuffs. But it had, of course, been made for Hazel, and Hazel was, well, comfortable. As was Nick. They went well together. Hazel bustled over. She was smiling hugely and had in her arms what looked like very small old eiderdowns, or maybe they were more like flattened pillows. Don't worry about that, dear. We'll pad you up in no time. Emma cringed inwardly but tried to laugh it off. Great! Because every Christmas elf wants nothing more than to have their padding fall out when they're not expecting it. Hazel chuckled. She was entirely unaware of the nerves growing in leaps and bounds in Emma's midriff. Why, oh why had she said she'd do this? Setting the pillows down, Hazel rummaged through a basket on the side table. Not to worry. I've got just the thing to keep everything in place. She pulled out several strips of what looked like thin tape, lined with tiny hooks on one side and loops on the other. Emma raised an eyebrow. It was almost as if Hazel had known this was going to happen. Maybe she really was a magical elf prepared for anything. This is great stuff, Hazel said. This will hold those pillows in place like they're glued to you. We'll stick a few strips inside the costume, pop the padding in, and just like that you'll be jolly and plump in no time, and no one will be any the wiser. Emma tried to laugh again, but it kept coming out like the awkward high-pitched cackle of a nervous hyena, sharp, uneven, and more unsettled than amused. Luckily, Hazel didn't seem to notice. She was already working on lining the inside of the costume with the tape. This way you won't have to worry about anything slipping out of place. We can't have the elf deflating halfway through the Christmas market now, can we? Emma smiled at the idea of a deflating elf. That wouldn't do at all. The idea of padding herself up had been mortifying at first, but the thought of having everything securely fastened made her feel a little more at ease. At least she didn't have to wear a figure-hugging costume in front of Jack. She felt self-conscious enough as it was. Hazel finished sticking the strips inside the costume and stuffed the pillows into place. "There," she said, "you're all set. Not too tight, and the magic tape will keep everything in place." Emma twirled in front of the mirror. "And there's this too, of course." Hazel held up the final piece. An elf hat with a long veil-like mask attached. It was designed to cover the entire face, leaving only the eyes visible. The fabric shimmered with tiny embroidered snowflakes glittering as Hazel waved it in front of her. "Nick always insisted on full anonymity," Hazel said. "The children never figured out who I was either. It's all part of the magic." Emma slipped the hat on, feeling the mask settle comfortably over her face. She could still see well enough and breathe unimpeded, but it gave her a sense of security, as if she could blend into the festive atmosphere without anyone knowing it was her. "Perfect," Hazel said, clapping her hands together. "You're the spitting image of a Christmas elf." Or a Christmas pillow, Emma thought, but smiled anyway, keeping the thought to herself. Hazel stood back and surveyed the results of her handiwork. Emma was pleased to note that she looked happy with it. She even took a photo with her phone. Emma gave another twirl, listening to the bells jingle with the movement. She wondered how long she could cope with that racket all the time. Hazel laughed. "You'll make a fine elf, dear. And the best part, no one will know it's you, not even that handsome Santa." Emma felt her cheeks flush as she glanced at her reflection. With the padding and the shimmering mask that covered her face, she was completely disguised, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Jack stretched his arms, yawned, and adjusted the belt around his Santa suit. He'd had no idea how long a day it was that Nick always put in. Also, the whole Santa thing had come about in such a hurry there'd been no chance to properly fit the suit. He'd have to ask his mum to sort out some better padding than he'd concocted for himself. His pillows kept slipping. When he was in full Santa flow, he didn't dare stand up in case one of the Morris-style heavyweight tapestry cushions shot out and felled a child. He glanced at the clock. Time to meet the new elf. Hazel had mentioned something about bringing in a replacement for her because she was busy with Nick. She'd been pretty tight-lipped about who it was, though. Jack was curious. Who on earth would Hazel trust with her elf duties? He hurried out of the house and down to the Christmas market, scanning the area for Hazel or her stand-in. Once in the grotto, he saw her. He thought it was a her, although he didn't know why he thought that. Maybe he'd just assumed it would be a her because Hazel was. The elf was standing near the Santa chair, a little hunched over and adjusting her belt. Something seemed a little off. She was bigger than Hazel, but only around the middle, like someone had overstuffed a teddy bear and slapped a hat on top. And the face was completely obscured by a sparkling mask. Only her eyes peered out from beneath the veil, and they flicked nervously around her. "Hazel?" Jack asked, moving closer. "Is that you?" He knew it wasn't, but he wasn't sure how else to approach this nervy-looking elf without frightening it off altogether. The elf whipped around, nearly knocking over the display of candy canes. "No?" she squeaked. Her voice was too high-pitched and rushed to be convincing. "Not Hazel. No, just, the elf. The completely normal elf." Jack was immediately on the alert. That voice. He tilted his head and stared at her as if he could see through the veil. He was conscious that a feeling of gladness was settling around him. It was Emma Frost, he just knew it. "Well, Ms. Elf, I must say you're looking different today. A little rounder?" he teased. She visibly stiffened but said nothing, so he decided to poke the bear some more. "Too many cookies?" She glared at him through the mask. How rude to make such personal comments. Jack was interested to note that he could read her body language despite all the padding and the veil. He could see the second she realised how ludicrous it was to be indignant about one's cushion stuffing. And she added, "It's part of the costume." She flapped her padded arms dramatically as if trying to take off and fly away. The bells on the cuffs jingled with every frustrated movement. They were going to be annoying if they made that racket on her every move. "Ah, of course," Jack said, trying really, really hard not to grin, and failing miserably. "It's all very convincing, especially the waistline. Very authentic." The elf stumbled over her own 2 big red shoes. They had curled up toes and little jingle bells at the tips. More annoying jingling. He was going to have nightmares about all this jingling when this was over, he could tell. She shifted awkwardly, tugging at the oversized belt. "You know, Santa," she said, clearly flustered, her voice snappy, "you don't exactly look like you've been skipping any meals yourself." Jack laughed aloud. "I'm going to call you Frostbite," he said, conscious that she looked up sharply. He held his hands up as if in surrender, and tried hard to keep his face entirely straight and innocent. Every elf needs a name after all. "Why Frostbite?" she asked suspiciously. "It's your repartee. It's brisk and frosty. I love it. Apart from that, you're a complete mystery to me, as every elf should be." "Exactly," she replied. "A complete mystery, just a jolly, anonymous elf. What should I call you?" "Oh, you know," he said. "Just call me Santa." Frostbite's eyes were so sharp he could almost feel them piercing him. He was also pretty sure she was blushing and cross with herself. He wanted her to feel better than that, though, so he deliberately softened his voice and added, "Besides, Frostbite suits you. A little bite, but very refreshing." Her gaze flickered, caught between suspicion and amusement, and for a moment he thought she might have smiled beneath the mask. "Refreshing?" she echoed. "Absolutely," Jack said, straightening up. "You're exactly the kind of elf Santa needs to keep him on his toes." There was a pause, and he thought he could see the tension in her shoulders easing a little. "Well, if that's the case," she said, her voice still a bit tight but a fraction less snappy, "I suppose Frostbite will do." "Good," he replied, openly grinning at her now, "because I can't think of anyone else who could pull it off quite like you." For a second he worried he'd gone too far, but then her posture relaxed, and Jack had the feeling the suspicion of him had fled. And that was enough for now. Chapter 7. Emma adjusted her mask. She still felt awkward, but she'd never been one for costumes, and she thought she could grow into this one. Well, not grow exactly. She just stopped herself from snorting a laugh. Rather, she could get used to it. The padding felt bulky, but helped with the disguise, so she was grateful for it. The jingling of the bells on her cuffs hadn't stopped being annoying, but she had to admit she liked feeling invisible behind the elf disguise with no one, not even Jack, knowing it was her. She stood near the back of the grotto watching as Jack greeted the children, his deep voice booming out the traditional jolly "ho, ho, ho." The kids' faces were so full of excitement and wonder it was a treat to see them. They came in, some cautiously, some running, clutching their wish lists. If they could take their gaze from Santa, they looked around in awe at the grotto itself, which was a work of festive art. She remembered all this so well from her own childhood. Actually, from her whole life. She had never lost the magic of it. Everything seemed normal until she noticed a young girl hesitating near the edge of the crowd, her small hands twisting nervously into the material of her blouse. Emma's heart clenched. She knew that look, the doubt and the sadness. It was exactly the way she must have looked when that Kathy Flinders down the road had insisted on telling her that Santa wasn't real. How on earth would Jack deal with it? A big-shot city lawyer wouldn't have a clue, surely. Emma tensed in indecision. What should she do? What could she do? The little girl took a timid step forward. She didn't rush to Santa like the others. She hung back, staring at Jack, her brow furrowed in confusion. Emma could feel her own breath catch. Did this little girl just hear the same cruel thing from her own Kathy Flinders? Jack leaned forward. Emma noticed he didn't hold his hands out to the child like Santa often did. He merely rested them on his knees as if to say to the child that he wasn't asking anything of her that she didn't want to give. Emma could only see the side of his face, which mainly consisted of beard, but when he spoke she could clearly hear gentleness in his tone. For a second she wondered if there'd been a miraculous switch and it was actually Nick inside the Santa suit. "I can see you're wondering about something," he said slowly. "Is it anything I can help with?" The little girl nodded. All Emma and Jack could see of her was the top of her head as she stared at the floor. Emma's anxiety ratcheted up. This was such a sensitive moment. She could do nothing. She was terrified that any movement she made, anything she said, might make things go the wrong way. Jack exuded an air of comfort, though, so she merely held her breath, waiting for what he would say. "You know," Jack continued, "some people don't believe in Santa. They think all the magic is gone once they grow up. Is this something you're worried about?" The child nodded her head, still staring at the floor. "May I call you Seraphina Elise?" "What?" Emma blinked. "What? Why would you want to call a little girl such a name?" The little girl looked up at that and laughed. "No, call me by my name, Maisie." "Oh, that's a much better name. Thank you, Maisie. I'll call you Maisie then." Emma was awestruck. What a stroke of genius. He'd not only got her name from her, but he'd also made her look at him and laugh. Emma backed away a little. She didn't want any of her own clumsiness to get in the way of this genius at work. Santa grinned at Maisie. Maisie grinned back. "Now," Santa said, "where were we?" "We were worried about whether Santa is real. We were worried all the magic might be gone when we grow up, Santa." "Oh yes, thank you for reminding me. Here's the thing. Magic doesn't look the same to everyone, but there will always be magic, especially if you want there to be." Emma was transported back to when Nick had said the same thing to her, and how it had made her feel after that Kathy Flinders down the road had been so mean. Nick had restored her faith in everything. She felt a strange mix of nostalgia and admiration as she watched Jack crouch down. He looked a little awkward, as if his padding was coming adrift. But it didn't matter to Maisie, whose gaze was glued to his face as he crouched down to her level, just like Nick had done for her. Emma's throat tightened. Jack wasn't just filling Nick's boots and his oversized suit. He was honouring him, and the Christmas spirit of Baublesville in every way. Maisie glanced over her shoulder. Emma looked too, to see a couple of people she assumed were her parents. They stood anxiously watching from the edge of the grotto. They nodded encouragingly, and Maisie's shoulders relaxed just a little more. Jack's voice was almost a whisper now, but Emma could still hear him. "You know where the real Christmas magic is? It's in here," he said, tapping his chest lightly with his gloved hand. "In all the joy, love and kindness that makes Christmas so special." He smiled and leaned a little closer. "I think you've got that magic inside you, Maisie, and I think you'll always have it, no matter how grown up you get." Emma didn't dare move at all. She didn't want to break the moment, and even the most trifling movement and these wretched bells started jingling and messing about. She froze in place and hoped she could stay still long enough. After an eternity of hesitation, Maisie stepped forward, sliding her small hand into Jack's. She looked up at him with wide eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Santa." Jack, his eyes crinkling at the corners, said, "Merry Christmas, Maisie." He squeezed her hand gently before letting her go. Emma felt tears close. In that moment something shifted. She saw Jack not just as the charming, teasing man who made her nervous, but as someone with real depth and heart, someone who understood how important it was to keep the magic alive. She stepped back slightly, unsure how to process this new feeling. The wretched bells jingled, and before she could fully retreat, Jack's gaze flicked up and locked onto hers. For a moment he seemed surprised to see her, as if he'd forgotten he wasn't alone with Maisie. Her breath hitched. None of it had been performative. She hadn't thought it was, but it was as if she'd been given proof. He'd forgotten she was there. Emma's heart thudded in her chest as if it had been in free fall and finally had landed, and she knew she loved him. She had never been so certain of anything in her life. How it had happened she had no clue, she just knew it had. Dazed, she went through the motions for the rest of the session before finally, and with great relief, going home to collapse into bed. The only trouble was that she then dreamed of that wretched Cathy Flinders from down the road dodging in her way and stopping her every time she tried to jump on Santa Jack's lap. Chapter 8. Sitting in the hospital chair next to Nick's bed, Jack stared at his hands. They were starting to look weird without the great Santa gloves on them. He was beginning to get way too comfortable wearing cushions and belts too. His thoughts, however, were far from the intricacies of Santa's costume. His thoughts were as tangled as the Christmas lights every year when his mum dug out the Christmas decorations box from the garage. He was supposed to be here for a short while to help his stepfather recover by filling in as Santa and supporting his mother. That was it. That had been the plan. But after today, after seeing Emma, after seeing her again, he wasn't so sure that going back to the city would be as simple as he had thought. "Everything go okay today?" Nick's voice broke through Jack's spiralling thoughts. Jack blinked. He managed a smile. "Yeah, fine. The kids were great." Jack noticed Nick's eyes narrow. His stepdad wasn't buying the simple answer. "And the elf? Was the elf great too?" The elf. Jack fought with himself not to laugh aloud, thinking about Emma, trying to disguise herself in that ridiculous costume, thinking he didn't know it was her. The image of her shuffling around, those damn bells jingling every time she moved, made his chest warm. But it wasn't just the elf part. It was Emma herself. There had been something about the way she'd been there for him today, always at hand to help with a crying child, or help finding the perfect gift, or help when his cushions came adrift. It was the way they'd worked so well together with barely a word. That's when a stray thought arrived in his brain. Had he fallen in love with her? Jack's heart stuttered at the thought. Fallen in love? Was that even possible? How could it happen so fast? And yet, every time he thought of Emma, the idea seemed less and less outlandish. But was it love? How would he even know? He wasn't exactly a romantic. His life was built on reason, on logic. The idea of love was almost too abstract to make sense. Wasn't love supposed to take time, to grow slowly like a fire that needed constant tending? And yet this didn't feel like something slow or uncertain. Every time he looked at Emma, something inside him shifted, like the ground was moving beneath him, pulling him towards her. Love at first sight, people always said. But could it really happen? Wasn't that whole thing about love at first sight in the same realm of magic as believing in Santa Claus? Oh, hang on. He'd just spent the day doing the Christmas magic thing. And then there was Maisie. He wasn't sure what had happened, but somewhere in the middle of that Santa session, he had started questioning everything. Why would he want to go back to the city? To an empty flat, even if it did overlook the river? To his full of logic but empty of magic career? To the sparkling but shallow nightlife? Why? Elf was great too, Jack said, keeping his tone as casual as he could manage. No disasters from Elf. No disasters even from the kids. Near disasters from my cushion padding. Nick chuckled, but there was a considering look on his face as he gazed at Jack. You know, when I first came to Baublesville, I wasn't sure if I'd stay either. It has its own magic, this place. Jack shifted uneasily in his chair. I'm not staying, he replied quickly. Maybe too quickly. I've got a job to get back to, you know that, and I don't want Mum to think I am when I'm not. Of course, Nick said. A good job too, I know. Don't worry. I'll say nothing to your mother. He paused and then added, but if you did want to stay, there would be a way. Jack sighed. That job is my life, Nick. I can't just walk away from it. Besides, what would I even do here? It's not like Baublesville has a law firm just waiting for me to jump into. Maybe it's time someone started one. Jack fell silent. What on earth had made his stepdad even think such a thing? Baublesville wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like a place he could live in. But the time spent with Maisie earlier had changed something in him. Helping her see the magic of Christmas the way Nick had told him had been as if he'd been telling himself the same thing. He'd asked Nick what to do if such a situation arose while he was keeping the Santa suit warm for him, not realizing the answer spoke to him too. Something stirred in him, something he wasn't ready to confront yet. Then there was Emma. His chest tightened at the thought of her. Her very presence had changed the air around him. There was no denying it. Emma was a huge part of why Baublesville suddenly felt harder to leave. But did she feel the same way? Would she even consider leaving Baublesville to be with him if she did? He knew how rooted she was here. Her bakery, her life, her family. It was her world. Why would she give that up for him? Why was it that he was the one thinking of giving up everything? His certainty about his life and his job in the city had always been rock solid. But now the thought of going back felt hollow, empty, like something important was missing. Which brought him back to Emma. It always came back to Emma. But was this love, or was it just the comfort of feeling as if he belonged somewhere? Before his mother and Nick married, he and Hazel had moved many times. It was as if it was only in Baublesville that she found her real home too. How could he explain the way his heart sped up every time he saw Emma? The way he couldn't stop thinking about her smile, or the way she made him feel like he was a different man here, maybe even a better man? Would she even feel the same way? Would she want him to stay? And if she did, why wouldn't she come with him to the city? He frowned at the thought. "You're overthinking again," Nick said. He reached out his hand and laid it comfortingly on Jack's shoulder. Jack was grateful for it, as if he'd been given permission to relax for a while. Even so, he frowned as he said, "I'm just trying to figure things out." "Figure what out?" came a familiar voice from the doorway. Hazel bustled in, her cheeks flushed from the cold outside, carrying a small bag of what Jack guessed were some of Emma's cookies. Hazel dropped the bag onto the bedside table, her gaze flicking between the two men. "What are you trying to figure out?" Hazel always wanted to know, because she always wanted to help anyone out if they were in a quandary, but sometimes people had to work it out for themselves. Jack opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. How could he explain what he didn't fully understand himself? How could he say that, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what his future was supposed to look like? "Just work stuff," he muttered, dodging the question. "Well, if you need any advice, I'm sure Nick and I can help. We've been around the block a few times, haven't we, my love?" she said to her husband, taking his other hand in her too. "Have I ever mentioned that it was love at first sight for me and Nick?" "Quite a few times," Jack said. "But why are you mentioning it now in particular?" As if he didn't know what she was hinting at. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe the magic of the Christmas season is making me think of all the other magic there is around, if you're open to it." Jack stared at his mother. What had made her say that? But Hazel was here for her husband. She settled next to Nick, talking softly to him, and Jack's thoughts drifted back to Emma, to how easy it had been to fall into the rhythm of Baublesville, to see the world through a different lens. And yet the big question still gnawed at him. Would Emma want him to stay? Would she even see a future with him? And if that spark he felt wasn't shared, would he even be thinking of giving up the life he'd built in the city? Jack wasn't used to not having the answers. How could he get the answers this time? How would he know if he had the right answer? Maybe it was simply easier to go back to the city where he knew all the answers and didn't suddenly find himself muddled in this messy indecision. He didn't like it. He preferred to know where he was going and who he was going there with. Chapter 9. It's just a slight fever, love, Hazel said, patting Emma's arm comfortingly. A low-grade fever, they called it. It's quite common and easily treatable. They just want to monitor him until they're sure it's nothing serious. I'm happy for him to be there for a few extra days. I'm worried he might overdo things if he's let out now anyway. You know what he's like. A Santa in a grotto. That's what he's like, Emma said. A bouncy Santa in a grotto. Yes, it's as well if they hang on to him a bit longer then. And please don't worry about me doing the elf thing. I'm fine for a few more days. Jenny's being really helpful and looking after the shop. Emma was conscious this was a particularly busy time of year to be away from Frosty's fancies, but Jenny was being brilliant. And oh, how she loved sharing the grotto with Jack. She didn't want it to end. Except, of course, she wanted Nick out of hospital, she added hastily to herself. And, of course, everything always ended. Usually when you didn't want it to. When she broke the news to Jenny and asked her if it was okay for her to stay on at the shop for a few more days, Jenny immediately agreed. You know what I love to see the most, she said, that look of joy on your face you always have on the first day of Christmas market, when you race down to the grotto and throw yourself on Santa. That look has been multiplied by a few million over the last few days. I'm not throwing myself on Santa's knees these days, Emma said. She went hot at the idea, or was it at the implication of what Jenny was saying? She raced away from the shop before Jenny started asking too many questions. When she arrived at the grotto, Jack was tugging on his voluminous Santa coat to try and get it all in the right place. But Emma could see his padding had slipped again. She could clearly see a tasseled cushion sticking out from beneath. Hey, Frostbite, Jack greeted her. I seem to have a bit of a crisis here. What now, Santa? She queried. Did you eat too many mince pies already? Are you overflowing? Jack had pulled the offending cushion right out now. I'm losing my festive figure. If I don't get this under control, I'm going to look a bit too deflated for a proper Santa. Honestly, you'd think a big-shot lawyer could figure out how to keep his own belly in place. She considered him. We really need Hazel. She's the one who could properly deal with these stuffing problems and slippages. Jack grinned. I'll remember to take the costume home tonight and ask her to fix something. These cushions have a mind of their own. We need to fix them for now, though. Emma crouched down to assess the damage. We can't have Santa's belly falling out halfway through some child's most fervent wishes being whispered into your ear. They'd be traumatized forever. Think of the headlines, Jack said. Santa deflates in front of horrified, scarred-for-life children. Frostbite elf to the rescue. Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't stop herself laughing. Do we have any string? Or wait, I've got an idea. She ran out to the back and found some of the soft gold rope they used to cordon off areas around the grotto. She headed towards the pile of neatly coiled ropes. Oh yes, I think these will do it. Jack raised an eyebrow. Are you about to tie me up, Frostbite? This isn't that kind of gig. Emma felt her constant eye-rolling around Jack must have made her eyes very fit, but still a giggle escaped her. Don't flatter yourself, Santa. I'm just trying to keep your belly from making a break for it. She grabbed one of the ropes and, approaching Jack, motioned for him to lift his arms. All right, hold still. I'm going to see if this can keep everything in place. Jack obeyed, but the way he grinned made Emma tense, not sure what he was going to come out with next. But it was relatively tame. You know, this could be my look. Santa with a golden sash, very regal. Regal isn't quite the word I'd use, but let's go with that. As she tightened the rope to keep the cushions in place, her fingers brushed against the soft fabric of his coat. She could feel Jack watching her. She tried to focus on the task, but the air between them felt warmer. It felt hot. Red hot. There, she said, hastily stepping back. That should hold everything together. You've officially been reinforced. Jack glanced down. I've got to say, I'm liking this upgrade. I might have to keep you around as my personal elf tailor. Emma crossed her arms. You couldn't afford me, Santa. You're probably right, but I'm impressed. You've turned gold rope into a fashion statement. Not a fashion statement exactly, more of a survival tactic. Let's see how long you can keep it together this time. He smiled at her, a smile that made the grotto very, very hot indeed. You'll be the first one I call if things start falling apart. I'm sure I will be, she said, straining to keep a light tone. It's a good thing you've got your elf to keep you in line. Jack held her gaze for a moment, his usual playful expression turning just a bit more serious. Yeah, I don't know what I'd do without you, Frostbite. Emma was very glad she wore a mask. Thanks for looking out for me, he added. Someone has to, Emma replied. She met his eyes and felt a flutter in her chest. There was something about him, something more than the banter and teasing, and it was getting harder to ignore. Now go ho-ho-ho your heart out before the kids waiting start to wonder if Santa really is in the grotto today. He saluted her and took to his Santa throne. Emma was sure she misheard, but she thought he'd said, Santa's nothing without his elf. Pardon? She said. Jack looked surprised, as if he hadn't realised he'd spoken aloud. We make a good team, you and I, he said. Which could have meant anything, Emma thought. He was just being polite then. Chapter 10. The hospital was quiet. The soft hum of machines and the occasional tapping of footsteps down the hall, the only sounds breaking the stillness. Jack sat beside Nick's bed. The overhead light had been dimmed and all seemed peaceful. Nick looked so much better now. Last time Jack had seen his stepdad had given him quite a scare. Despite everything, though, Nick still wore that mischievous grin that Jack had got used to over the last few years since he and Hazel had got together. So, Nick said, his voice definitely stronger than it had been a few days ago. How's the Santa gig treating you? Any of the kids tried to pull your beard off yet, or tried to sneak their way onto your nice list by pretending to be someone else? Or tried to bribe you for extra presents? Jack laughed, shifting his position in the uncomfortable hospital chair. Not yet, although I think they're more interested in Frostbite than they are in me. Nick raised an eyebrow. Frostbite? Do you mean the elf, Emma? Jack's chest tightened slightly at the mention of her name. Yes, she's good at it. The kids love her. Nick smiled. Yes, they always loved Hazel when she was elf, too. The elf's been a part of that grotto for as long as Santa has, helping to keep the magic alive. Jack nodded, staring at his hands. He hadn't taken into account the magic when he'd first arrived. He'd talked about the magic to that child, Maisie, but only because Nick had rehearsed him for that very situation, and he'd seen it work, and he could see it now. And the way Emma lit up around the kids, the way she poured her heart into everything she did, was all part of the magic. So, Nick said, breaking the silence, what's going on with you? You look like you've got something on your mind. Jack hesitated, glancing toward the door. He hadn't planned to bring this up tonight, but it was on his mind. He took a deep breath. I got a call yesterday from the city. Nick's eyes sharpened. Oh, something important? Jack nodded. They offered me a job upgrade, a big one. Head of the litigation department. Honestly, it's the kind of offer I never thought I'd get this early in my career. Nick was quiet for a moment. Jack almost felt uncomfortable under his gaze. Sounds like quite the opportunity. It is quite the opportunity, Jack said. It's huge. A massive salary, high-profile clients, and a fast track to senior partner. It's the kind of job people wait their whole lives for. Before Nick could respond, he thought he heard a soft rustle by the doorway. Jack glanced up, catching a brief movement out of the corner of his eye. But the doorway was empty. He frowned. Maybe he'd imagined it. Nick's voice caught his attention again. Are you going to take it? Jack hesitated. I don't know. You don't know? Jack, a week ago you would have jumped at that chance without thinking about it at all. Jack stared up at the ceiling. I know, that's what's confusing me. What's changed? Nick asked softly. Jack let out a long breath. He'd been holding it for too long, trying to get his thoughts in order. I didn't expect to feel this way about Baublesville, about coming home. I've never thought of it as home before. I mean, I was already living in the city when you and Mum got together. but somehow now it does. It feels like home. And then there's Emma. Jack was impressed with how straight Nick managed to keep his face, and how neutral his tone of voice was when he said, "Ah." He shook his head, frustrated. I don't even know if she feels the same way. I mean, she's got her whole life here, the bakery, her friends, her family. I can't expect her to just pack up and move to the city with me. Not to mention that's an enormous ask after only a few days, Nick said. Sorry, just thought I'd mention it. Oh, come on, Jack replied. You and Mum fell in love instantly. Maybe it's a trait that runs in the family. That's true. You do have your mother's capacity for instant decisions. Nick smiled fondly at him. So what are you going to do? That's the thing, Nick said. I don't know. I want this job. I should want this job. But every time I think about leaving, something holds me back. You've always been good at figuring out the right move in your career. But this is about more than a professional strategy. It's about your heart, your family, your contentment, your magic. Jack nodded. He didn't know what to say. He knew Nick was right. This was much more important than professional progression and a luxury flat by the river in the city. He couldn't ever remember feeling so unsettled about anything. Chapter 11. Emma loved being Frostbite the elf, except for the bits where a child would come in with their father. Usually they came in with their mother. When it was their dad, though, her chest would feel as though it was closing. Her eyes would sting, and she would not let herself blink for too long in case tears fell, and then they'd sting even more. She wondered if she'd ever grow out of missing her father. He'd died so suddenly, and she'd been so young. She'd not understood for a very long time how he was there one moment and gone the next, without even saying goodbye. Every time a father would crouch down beside his child, especially if it was a girl, her loss seemed to grow larger and more difficult to control. Wasn't it better never to love someone than to love them and then lose them and have to suffer this incredible pain? This thought started to make itself felt in the long dark reaches of the night when there were no other distractions to keep her mind from going there. She loved the easy camaraderie that was growing between her and Jack. She loved the way he made her feel. There was no particular thing he said or did, but somehow he made her feel safe and loved. She'd always felt safe and loved in this grotto, though. Was it the grotto, or was it Jack, and her new-found role as chief elf? That night, after she'd left the grotto, checked on Jenny in the shop, set things up for the following morning in the bakery, she called into the hospital to see Nick. As she approached his room, she heard the unmistakable rumble of Jack's voice. She stopped, wondering whether to go home rather than barge in on his time with Nick, which was how she came to hear him say, "It's huge. A massive salary, high-profile clients, and a fast track to senior partner. It's the kind of job people wait their whole lives for." Stunned, Emma backed away from Nick's room. She stopped and stared at the wall for a moment and then turned to leave. She left very quickly, hurrying down the corridors and only breathing deeply when she was once more outside. Looking around the car park, the world suddenly felt as if it had grown colder and more dangerous. She made her way back to the bakery. On the way she called Jenny. "I wonder if you would be so kind as to take over as elf," she asked. "We're the same size, so the costume will fit you." The long silence from the other end of the phone call made her wonder if she'd got through. "Jenny? What's going on? You've been so happy being Frostbite. What's wrong? Will you do it?" "Of course I'll do it, but you were happy doing it." "The costume's in the chest in the back of the grotto. I'm just going into Frosty's Fancies to start a batch of sourdough. I'll see you tomorrow if you'd like to call in on your way home or before you go in." "Oh no," she'd accidentally cut off the call before Jenny could get too inquisitive. Emma slogged her way to her shop, got everything ready, and started a massive programme of baking, trying not to think of anything at all. However, she might have known Jenny wouldn't leave it at that. A sharp rapping on the window pane declared that she was impatiently waiting to be let in. "What's going on?" she demanded the second Emma opened the door to her. He's been offered an incredible job and he's going back to the city, Emma said, turning back to her work table. Did he say this? Why would he choose me and small-town life over a fast-paced, prestigious career in an exciting city? Did he say this? Not exactly. Well, not to me, but I heard him talking to Nick and telling him about the job. Then you don't know that he is leaving, do you? No, but it made me realise that I don't want to be hurt all over again. It's too risky, I couldn't bear it, so it's best to pull back now. She was surprised when Jenny had nothing to say to this. Her friend merely rolled up her sleeves, washed her hands, and joined her at the work table, cutting out more Christmas biscuits. Of course, they were Santa biscuits. Of course they were. Chapter 12. Jack settled into the Santa throne, casting a glance toward the entrance of the grotto. Frostbite, or Emma, should have been here by now. She was never late, and usually by this point she'd be giving him a hard time about his beard, or teasing him about his Santa belly cushions. He fiddled with the fur trim on his sleeve, feeling a strange knot of apprehension in his chest. Where was she? Then came the jingle of bells, and he looked up, his heart lurching in anticipation of seeing his elf. But it wasn't his elf. This elf pulled off her mask, revealing a bright, cheerful grin that didn't belong to Frostbite. Ho, 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 Santa. Ready for a day of festive fun? Jack blinked. Hi? The elf put out her hand. I'm Jenny, Emma's best friend, bakery sidekick, and emergency elf in times of need. Jack shook her hand, trying to keep up. Jenny, right, Emma's best friend. He forced a smile. Nice to meet you. Jenny raised an eyebrow. Not what you expected, huh? Jack shook his head, trying to get his bearings. Where's Emma? Emma asked me to take over today. Something about sourdough rising and a baking emergency. She shrugged, clearly not fazed by the last-minute change. So here I am, ready to rock the elf gig. Jack tried to sound casual, although his mind was still spinning. Is she okay? Emma? Jenny waved a hand dismissively. Oh, she's fine. You know how it is. Sometimes a girl needs a day in the bakery. Dough waits for no one. Jack frowned. That didn't sound like the Emma he knew. She'd been so enthusiastic about the elf gig. Why would she ask someone else to step in? Before he could ask more questions, Jenny said, Don't worry, Santa. I promise I'm a solid elf. Been doing Christmas stuff with Emma for years. You're in good hands. Jack chuckled despite himself. I'm sure I am. It's just that I was expecting her, that's all. Jenny shot him a knowing look, but thankfully she didn't pry. Well, I'm sure she'll be back soon, but for now you've got me. Before Jack could respond, the first group of children arrived, their excited voices filling the grotto. Jenny jumped up, adjusting her hat with a grin. All right then, let's get this show on the road. Let's make some Christmas magic. Jack plastered on his Santa smile, though his mind was still on Emma. He had to find out why she wasn't here. Was something wrong? So when a child stomped his feet and claimed that Santa promised him a dragon last year and he never got it, so here he was this year giving Santa a chance to make up for the mistake he'd so obviously made last year, Jack found himself at a complete loss. He stared at the child as he aggressively made his statements again. You said I'd get a dragon. It never turned up. I'm really upset about it, so you can give it to me now instead. Jack blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. For one thing, he was pretty certain Nick wouldn't have promised any child a dragon, but he couldn't very well call the child, Jimmy, a little fibber, a little fibbing fibber. Out of the corner of his eye he noticed Jenny Elf standing, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised, clearly waiting to see how Santa was going to dig himself out of this one. He gave Jimmy a very serious look, and instead of saying fibber, he said, the dragon from last year. He stroked his beard as if deep in thought. Here's the thing about dragons. They take time to find the right person to care for them. It's not just about getting a dragon, you see. It's about earning their trust. They don't appear until you're absolutely ready. Jimmy's scowl lessened a little. I've been ready since last year. Jack nodded. Well, Jimmy, dragons don't come to people just because they ask. Dragons need to feel that their future master has the heart of a true hero. So tell me, have you been working on your hero training? Jimmy repeated. Hero training? Of course, hero training. It's a very important step. You need to show bravery, kindness, and patience, all the things that make a hero worthy of a dragon. If you can focus on those, well, I think we might just see a dragon arrive when the time is right. Jimmy's scowl had been replaced with a determined look. Hero training, he said. I can do that. I have no doubt you can, Jimmy. And when the time comes, that dragon will know you're ready. Jimmy saluted and marched off, ready to excel at his newfound mission. As soon as he was out of earshot, Jenny sidled up to Jack, shaking her head. You didn't like Jimmy, did you? I mean, he's never going to get a dragon, is he? You don't believe in dragons? Do you believe in dragons? I will if he at least tries to tell the truth and be kind. He'll deserve a dragon then. What if he is kind all year and comes back next year and demands his dragon? He already knows the dragon will turn up if he's good enough. Also, next year he'll be that much older and he'll know there are no such things as dragons. Jenny still stared at him, so he added, Also, it'll be Nick's problem next year. Well, I can see why you're such a hotshot lawyer. No wonder you're going back to the city for a super-duper job. What? But there was no time for Jenny to answer because the next child was already in there, staring expectantly at them. For a brief moment, Jack's mind reeled from Jenny's exclamation about him going back to the city. Before he could process it, the shrill sound of Felicity's cries yanked him back to the present. But why didn't you bring Rudolph? He's the best, Felicity shouted, her face red with frustration. I'm not leaving until I see him. Jack swallowed, feeling a momentary urge to run for the exit himself. But he knew Emma wouldn't approve, so he stayed. Ah, Felicity, he said, I understand. Rudolph is everyone's favourite. Here's the thing, Jack continued. Rudolph is very special, but he's also got a very important job. He's back at the North Pole right now getting extra ready for Christmas Eve. He has to be ready for Christmas Eve, doesn't he? Felicity nodded, wiping her eyes. Of course he does. I hadn't thought of that. I wouldn't want him to miss Christmas Eve. Jack gave her a warm smile. Exactly. He's got to make sure he's all set, because I need him at his very best for the big night. But when I see him later, I'll let him know you were asking about him. In fact, Jack reached into his pocket, pulling out a small silver bell. Here, this is one of the bells from his harness. You can keep it as a reminder that he'll be flying over your house very soon. Felicity's eyes widened as Jack handed her the bell. She stared at it in awe. The tears were gone, replaced by a bright smile. Thank you, Santa. Felicity skipped away, clutching the bell tightly. Not bad, Santa, Jenny said. Not bad at all. You're certainly adding to the Christmas magic. Jack stared. Just a few short days ago he'd have scoffed in disbelief if someone had said that about him. It was Baublesville. It must be. Baublesville was turning him into someone else. Someone who Jenny thought was leaving for the city. And if Jenny thought it, then Emma must be thinking it too. He stared at the entrance of the grotto again, still hoping to see Emma coming in, knowing she wouldn't. Not as she thought he was leaving. Was that why she'd bailed? Because she thought he was leaving Baublesville? And it mattered to her? Was wishful thinking building it in his mind into something it wasn't? Santa? A small voice tugged at his attention, and Jack snapped back to reality. A little girl stood in front of him, eyes wide, waiting for an answer. Pardon? He said. Where's Mrs. Claus? Jack blinked. Oh, she's busy working on some sourdough? The little girl frowned, clearly confused, and Jenny swooped in with a laugh, nudging Jack's arm. Not quite, Santa, she said, shooting him a sharp look. Mrs. Claus is busy feeding up the reindeer, remember? So they have extra energy for Christmas Eve. Of course she is, Jack said. She's feeding the reindeer. That's what I meant. Jenny handed the little girl a candy cane and sent her off with a conspiratorial wink. Santa's been working too hard, but he'll definitely be back on form in time for Christmas Eve. Turning back to Jack, Jenny said, "Sourdough, huh? Distracted, are we?" Jack coughed. He adjusted his beard. "I'm not distracted." He adjusted his hat. "I'm not. Thing is, though, she didn't say anything about stepping back. She just hasn't come in to do her elf duties." Jenny said, "Look, I'm not giving away any confidences, but I will say this. You should talk to her. Sometimes people pull back when they're afraid of what might happen if they step forward." Jack frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jenny shrugged. "I don't know. I'm just the elf, right?" She darted off to hand out candy canes. Chapter 13. Jack ran Jenny's words over in his mind, trying to make sense of them. Afraid of what might happen if they stepped forward. Was Emma pulling back because of him? That didn't make sense. They'd been getting along fine, hadn't they? She'd been teasing him, helping him fix his Santa suit, laughing at his jokes. But something had changed. Yesterday everything had felt easy. Today Emma was gone. Jack's grip on the arms of the Santa throne tightened, feeling a sudden surge of frustration. He didn't like to be left in the dark, especially when it came to someone he cared about. His heart gave an uncomfortable and unexpected lurch. He had come to care about her more than anything. He'd already known it, but now it was as if the knowledge had expanded and taken over his world. He needed to see her. He needed to talk to Emma, find out why she was pulling away. He needed to find out if his feelings for her were as real as he thought they were. Jack jumped to his feet. "Hey, Jenny!" She looked up, candy cane in hand. "What's up, Santa?" "I'm going to talk to her. Emma." Jenny smiled as if she'd been expecting this all along. "Good idea. And don't worry, I'll hold down the fort here. Go get your girl." Jack paused, staring at her. "She's not my—" Jenny waved a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. I've witnessed the way you've been mooning around all day. No hotshot lawyer would do that unless it was love." Jack opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead he just nodded. "Thanks, Jenny." "Any time, Santa," she said with a grin. "Now go, before she bakes herself into oblivion. But first—" But Jack was no longer listening. He heard her yell, "Wait, Santa, you've still got—" He ignored it. He was already halfway out of the grotto. As he jogged through the streets of Baublesville, snow swirling around him, he noticed children waving at him. Dutifully he waved back, but it took a while before he realized he was still wearing the full Santa suit. Of course he was. He could hardly disrobe in public and shatter the illusions of Baublesville children by running the rest of the way in his shorts and t-shirt. Also, it was cold. The suit would have to stay on for now. The bell above the door to Frosty's Fancies jingled as Jack pushed it open. The warmth of the bakery greeted him. Emma was at the counter. She looked startled. But before he could say anything, a small boy dressed in a Santa suit ran up to him and tugged at his sleeve. "Santa!" he exclaimed. "It's you!" Jack blinked, glancing down at the boy. Well, no." "I'm sorry," a woman said. Jack assumed it was the boy's mother. "Sorry he's being a nuisance." Jack was alerted by the sudden paroxysm of exaggerated coughs Emma went into that he couldn't just disillusion this child for his own convenience. Hastily he corrected himself. "No, he's not. Please don't worry," he said to the mother. Turning to the boy, he said, "No doubt about it. It's me, Santa." The boy's face lit up with excitement. "I knew you'd come. I was wishing you'd come, and you did. I want to learn how to be Santa. My family needs a Santa." His mother clapped her hands to her mouth, and tears came to her eyes. "The most important thing, Santa," the boy went on, "is for people to tell you their wishes, isn't it? So you know what to do about them. Maybe you could tell me yours and see if I do it properly. See if I listen properly. Come and sit down." The boy tugged on Jack's sleeve, heading for a child's chair near the counter. You've been so busy giving everyone else their presents. Don't you think it's time you got a wish?" Jack paused, caught off guard. He was also worried about the fragility of the chair he was supposed to sit on. "My wish?" he asked, a strange warmth spread through his chest. The boy nodded earnestly, tugging Jack over to the chair. It was right by the counter behind which Emma stood. "Yes, it's your turn. You should sit down and tell me your wishes." Jack's heart frolicked around a bit as he looked from the boy to Emma. She had stilled at the counter. Her face was flushed and tense as she gazed at him. The air was heavy between them. The little boy, sensing something was amiss, looked up at Jack pleadingly. "Please, Santa, sit down. Tell us what your wishes are." Jack glanced down at the very, very small chair by the counter. This is ridiculous, he thought. But then he saw the way Emma was biting her lip, avoiding his gaze, and something inside him knew the right thing to do. Without further thought, he turned the chair so that he could still see her, and then sat down on it, much to the delight of the little boy. The chair creaked ominously under him, and Jack tried very hard to keep his full weight off it. His leg muscles soon protested at his half-crouch, half-sitting posture. He leaned forward, gazing steadily at Emma. She still wouldn't look at him directly, but he could see tension radiating from her. "All right, Santa," the boy said seriously. "It's your turn now. What do you wish for?" Jack smiled slowly, despite feeling as if his heart was trying to kick its way out of his chest. "I had a very special elf on my team, but Frostbite, my favourite elf ever, left me to get on with everything by myself." "No, she didn't. You've got Jenny the elf now," Emma said. "And Jenny the elf is a delight, but she's not my favourite elf. She's not the one I want to spend the rest of my life with." The boy giggled. "That's funny, Santa, but you can't marry an elf." "I think we can build something magical here in Baublesville, though," Jack said. The little boy laughed uncertainly. "Is that your Christmas wish, Santa?" He sounded disappointed, as if he'd expected Santa to want a motorized sleigh or an under-the-sea toy workshop with elevators to the surface. Jack smiled, nodding. He was going to say it again in case Emma hadn't got it. "It is indeed. My Christmas wish is for Frostbite to be by my side, building something special here in Baublesville." The boy grinned. "I hope your wish comes true, Santa." Emma and Jack shared a look. "I think it might," she said. The boy, confused but happy, nodded. "Merry Christmas, Santa. How did I do? Could I be a Santa too when I'm older?" "You certainly could," Jack said, and the child skipped away, content that he'd performed his role so well that the wishes proclaimed were going to come true. When he'd gone, Jack stepped closer to Emma, taking her hand. He was aware there were still others in the shop, but he didn't care. None of them were children, so he didn't have to worry about giving Santa away now. "I'm not going anywhere, Emma. This is where I want to be, with you." He gazed into her eyes. "I've spent my life chasing success, running toward the next big thing. But when I met you, Emma, I stopped running. I found something I didn't even know I needed. A place to belong. Someone to belong with. My Christmas wish is for you to be by my side for the rest of our lives." Emma's grip on his hand tightened. She gazed at him as if she'd never stopped wanting to see him. He so hoped she never did stop wanting to see him. "I want to build a home and a family here in Baublesville," Jack continued. "With you." He glanced down at their entwined hands and back up to her. He wished she'd say something. So he added, "Oh, and I could really use a new Santa chair. This one's not quite big enough." Was it his imagination, or did her face soften? Were his words finally convincing her? The bakery felt quieter now. They might as well have been on their own in a woodland clearing with snow floating silently down around them. Finally Emma, her voice barely a whisper, said, "I didn't think you'd stay. I thought you had everything you wanted in the city. I couldn't bear to let myself hope you'd stay for me. But now," her voice faltered, "you're really staying, Jack, for me?" Jack shook his head. "Emma, I was never going to leave. Not after I met you. Not after I got to know Frostbite. You're the reason I'm staying, if you'll have me." "You were staying for me?" "For you, for this place, for everything I didn't even know I was looking for when I first came here." Emma dropped his hand and took a step back, shaking her head. "Jack, don't say these things unless you mean them. Don't make promises you can't keep." Jack held his hand out to her as if asking for her to hear him. "Emma, look at me. I've never meant anything more in my life. I'm staying. I'm here for good. I don't want the city. I don't want the job. I want you." The warmth of the bakery wrapped around them, the soft glow from the wood-burning stove flickering against the snow-dusted windows. The scent of cinnamon and ginger lingered in the air. And as Emma looked at Jack, it was like the rest of the world had faded away. A moment longer and Emma smiled, a bright, genuine, elfish smile that reached her eyes. "Well, Santa," she said softly, "I think your Christmas wish is about to come true. It seems to have met with my Christmas wish, and my Christmas wish and your Christmas wish go very well together." She reached for Jack's hand and pulled him toward the full-size armchair by the fire. When he sat down, she hesitated for just a moment before settling on his knee. "I think this might be where we both belong. My Christmas surprise has turned into my Christmas wish." Jack wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. His lips found hers, and Emma relaxed completely into him. In that moment, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. He pulled back to look into her face. "Merry Christmas, Frostbite," he whispered. Emma smiled. "Merry Christmas, Santa."